Good evening, and welcome to Understanding and Dismantling Racism. This is the first of a four-part presentation, and tonight's topic is race, understanding race as and its power of illusion. My name is Tom Cordaro, and I'm the Justice and Outreach Minister at St. Margaret Mary Catholic Parish in Naperville, Illinois. I'm also an anti-racism and anti-racism organizer and trainer, and I've worked with parishes and with Catholic universities and colleges, but mostly I've worked with Catholic peace and justice organizations over the last 20 years in their efforts to dismantle racism. I got my training through Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizers and Trainers. This is a group that works with organizations and institutions to dismantle institutional racism within their own groups. I also served as a member of their board of directors. Now, talking about racism in this country can trigger apprehension and confusion and fear in many people. It's one of those subjects that can make people very uncomfortable and very hesitant. So I'd like to begin by telling you what I told our elementary school children when I talked to them about racial justice. Talking about racism can be hard, and sometimes it can make you feel very uncomfortable. But I want you to know that it's okay to feel uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable when talking about racism is actually pretty normal. But I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Try to keep an open heart and an open mind to what you're going to hear during these next 4 sessions. And know this, that often we learn the most important things in life when we're made to feel a little uncomfortable. That said, I've taken some measures to reduce any anxiety you might feel about participating. All participants will have their audio and visual functions turned off in order to protect your anonymity. At the end of my presentation, we're going to have a question and answer period for you to ask questions or to make comments. You can do that by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. You can send a question or comment to chat at any time during this presentation, and know that it would be private. The only people who will be able to see your question or your comment will be my assistant, Bill Hassett. Bill will collect all of those questions and comments, and then at the end, when we have our question and answer period, Bill will relay them to me. Now, keep in mind that there's no such thing as a stupid question or a silly question, especially when working in the issue of racism. The truth is that we are all learners and beginners when it comes to understanding and dismantling racism in our country and in our lives. Another thing I want to state up front is that this 4-part presentation is directed primarily to white people because St. Margaret Mary Parish is a predominantly white congregation. Now, there's a lot in my presentations that hopefully will be insightful and helpful for people of color. And of course, they're very welcome to participate. However, my focus is going to be directed to my fellow white Catholic parishioners. So let's get started. First, let's be clear. The church teaches us that racism is a sin. In fact, racism is described with the same language as abortion is used. It's called an intrinsic evil. Recently, Pope Francis reminds us, quote, "We cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim to defend the sacredness of all human life." And while everyone can agree, I think, that racism is evil, there's little consensus beyond that, especially between racial groups. Often efforts to address racism in this country flounder because those working to try to end racism, they don't take the time to come to a common understanding of what it is. This often results in people talking past one another instead of talking to one another. And of course, it makes the challenge of creating a consensus on action extremely difficult. Now, as an anti-racism organizer and trainer, I learned a real important axiom when it comes to organizing, and that is DDT. Diagnosis determines therapy. And what this means is that the way we understand and define a problem determines the strategies that we're going to develop to address that problem. So for instance, if you have pneumonia and you go to your doctor's office and he diagnoses you as having a common cold, well, then you're in serious trouble, right? Now, one reason coming to a common understanding of racism can be difficult is because of the different ways that racism is experienced and understood by people of different races. Now, both white people and people of color are familiar with the bigoted racial attitudes and behaviors that they can encounter in individuals they meet from day to day. However, many people of color also experience racism in the form of institutional structures and systems that deny them access to the resources that they need to develop to their fullest human potential. For this reason, most white people determine whether or not something is racist or not by focusing on personal intentions. Was there racial animosity underlying the action in question? On the other hand, most people of color make a determination of racism based on the outcome, right? Did the action result in a denying of a person or a group of people the same access to resources and power that other groups have? So what we need is we need an understanding of racism that bridges this gap. Let's begin by taking a closer look at that word, racism. Now, etymology is the study of the origin and structure of words that can help us understand the meaning of that word. And so we can see from the word racism that it has something to do with race. So let's begin our exploration of racism by looking at this notion of race from a scientific point of view. I'm going to show you two short video clips taken from the video series entitled Race, the Power of Illusion. If you're interested in seeing the whole three-part series, you can find a complete copy on YouTube. And also,
geneticist was always to try to actually characterize how much genetic variation there was between individuals and groups. And I spent a lot of time worrying about that, like other people in my profession.
In the 1960s, Richard Lewington decided to find out just how much genetic variation fell within and how much between the groups we regard as races. A new technology enabled him to do pioneering work.
And that method, which is called gel electrophoresis, a very fancy name, we were able to use on any organism at all. If you could grind it up, you could do it. That included people. I mean, you have to grind the whole person, but you could take a little bit of tissue or blood. Over the years, a lot of data were gathered by anthropologists and geneticists looking at blood group genes and protein genes and other kinds of genes from all over the world. I mean, anthropologists just went around taking blood out of everybody. I must say, if I were a South American Indian, I wouldn't have let them take my blood, but they did. And so I thought, well, we've got enough of these data. Let's see what it tells us about the differences between human groups.
Lewontin's findings were a milestone in the study of race and biology.
If you put it all together, and we've now got that for proteins, for blood groups, and now with DNA sequencing, we have it for DNA sequence differences, it always comes out the same. 85% of all the variation among human beings is between any two individuals within any local population, between individuals within Sweden or within the Chinese or the Kikuyu or the Icelanders.
To put it another way, of the small amount of variation in our genes, there is apt to be as much difference between Gorgeous and her teammate Christine as there is between Gorgeous and her opponent Kaylin. Any two individuals within any so-called race may be as different from each other as they are from any individual in another so-called race.
Are the people who we call black more like each other than they are like people who we call white, genetically speaking? The answer is no. There's as much or more diversity and genetic difference within any racial group as there is between people of different racial groups.
Still, we know that some genes are found with greater frequency in some populations.
And geography is the better way to explain that more than race or anything else. There can be accumulations of genes in one place in the globe and not another.
Race does not account for patterns of genetic variation. Our recency as a species and the way we have moved and mated throughout our history does. Our human lineage originated in Africa. About 2 million years ago, small groups of early hominids, not modern humans, began a first migration out of Africa to the far reaches of the globe, breeding isolated lineages. It was long thought, and is still believed by some, that those first lineages led to genetically distinct races that are with us today.
It turns out that's not true. I think there's almost genetic proof now, I wouldn't say the issue is totally resolved, that those lineages just died out, that Neanderthals in Europe died, that Homo erectus in Asia died, that there was a second migration of our modern species, Homo sapiens, and that all modern humans are products of the second migration, which is probably less than 100,000 years old by the best current evidence.
Some of those movements may follow major migrations as agricultural people came into Europe, as people crossed the Bering Strait and came into the Americas. But other movements are much more subtle. They're smaller groups of individuals that moved, or their genes moved from place to place and time to time. We've had maybe 100,000 years of having genes move out and mix and reassort in countless different ways.
100,000 years may seem like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it is a blink of the eye. Human populations have not been isolated from each other long enough to evolve into separate subspecies.
There just hasn't been time for the development of much genetic variation, except that which regulates some very superficial features like skin color and hair form. But once the old cliche is true, under the skin we really are effectively the same, and we get fooled because some of the visual differences are quite noticeable.
Okay, so that's the first one. Now, We now know, of course, that this notion of distinct races is not supported by scientific data and scientific evidence. However, there was a time when it was thought to be very scientific. And now we're going to look at this second video, which also talks about the story we tell ourselves about race.
During the 19th century, there were lots of public lectures on the races of man. Science was, because it was new, was something people were avidly interested in. Science in the 19th century was expected to reveal all the mysteries of the universe.
You even see specific references by this period where they're saying race is the great issue of the age.
The nation's interest in race was more than idle fascination. In the 1840s, the question of whether slavery would expand to newly acquired Western lands was bitterly dividing the nation and fueling attacks on slavery.
There was significant momentum towards the abolition of racial slavery, but there were also very strong countervailing trends. And in the end, this created an enormous tension within white society because it was caught in this contradiction that was inescapable.
As people begin to oppose slavery, the whole question of what the difference between the races is and what the status of black people should be becomes more debated. In the context of this debate over slavery versus anti-slavery, ideas about race really flesh out.
In 1846, 5,000 people gathered in Boston to hear The Plan of Creation in the Animal Kingdom, the first American lecture by renowned Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz. His methods valued observation over speculation. Agassiz was quickly pulled into the scientific question of the day. Are all people, no matter their physical features, members of the same or different species?
It's a debate between people who look at the book of Genesis and see what they call a single creation. God created Adam and Eve. And scientists who say, well, actually, these races couldn't possibly have come from the same place. There must be different and separate creations.
Agassiz arrived in America, supporting the theory that all humans were united in a single creation. But he soon began to rethink his position after meeting one of America's most distinguished scientists, Samuel Morton. A Philadelphia physician, Morton owned the world's largest collection of human skulls and had written 2 influential books documenting what he claimed were innate differences among humans. One focused on American Indians.
The foundation work was a work called Crania Americana, in which he argued that he was using purely scientific methods to investigate the question of skull size, skull capacity, which had implications for brain size, which he thought was vital in how races progressed.
Lo and behold, he discovers that white American males are the smartest people on earth, followed in gradation by the English, the French, and then other Europeans, and then other races with blacks always on the bottom. Curiously, some English scholars do the same thing. They discover Englishmen are actually smarter than Americans, followed by French and other Europeans. And guess what? The French discover that the French are really smarter than both.
Somehow he managed to make sort of systematic errors in favor of what was the, the sort of understood hierarchy of the races of the day.
Samuel Morton drew wild conclusions based on very careful studying and ranking of these skulls. I don't care how many times you measure a skull or even anything physical about an individual or a group of people, you cannot predict their morality, their behavior, their achievements, potential for achievement. But that was what was important about this idea of race at the time.
Southerners were actually delighted at what the scientists were doing. They were hearing from, if you like, non-special interests that there were huge differences between the races. Now, this meant that the South began to argue quite vigorously that the best scientific opinion is saying that slaves cannot exist within a free white society and that they are inferior.
The ultimate defense of slavery is a racial defense. That blacks are inferior and therefore they are ready-made slaves. God created them as slaves.
Why all this rant about Negro equality, asked John Campbell in his book Negromania, seeing that neither nature or nature's God ever established any such equality? Josiah Nott, a Southern doctor and disciple of Morton, firmly believed that black people were a separate species and used science to wage a vigorous defense of slavery.
Though he was a good doctor, I mean, for the period, and well regarded as an expert on yellow fever, he immediately starts to show from his very first writings that when he writes about race, he throws off really any scientific realism at all and writes from his prejudices. It seems so exaggerated. It looks like the publication you'd get on a sort of a dirty little leaflet that some fringe organization has published, and yet it's accepted scientific fact for a time.
As these ideas took hold, pro-slavery advocates argued that the enslavement of black people did not violate the democratic spirit of America, because Jefferson's term, all men, did not scientifically include black people. In 1850, Louis Agassiz, by then Harvard's most prominent professor, told his fellow members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science that, viewed zoologically, the several races of men were well marked and distinct. Josiah Nott wrote to Samuel Morton, "With Agassiz in the war, the battle is ours."
Here was the most objective, the pinnacle of the scientific man influenced by American racism, and who transformed his deeply held belief in the unity of mankind. I think that says more than anything else that the power of the ideology of race can change people's minds.
3 years later, Agassiz contributed a chapter to a forthcoming book, co-authored by Nott. The 738-page Types of Mankind was greatly anticipated. It pre-sold its entire first edition.
Types of Mankind was tremendously influential. It was the first time that scientists pulled together all of the research that justified the argument that African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, etc., were different species.
Nations and races, like individuals, have each an especial destiny. Some are born to rule, and others to be ruled. And such has ever been the history of mankind. No two distinctly marked races can dwell together on equal terms.
Types of Mankind was one of the best-selling science books of its day. Among the first to buy it were the United States Departments of State, Navy, and Treasury.
Science and the politicians and popular opinion weld together in a way that is extremely useful for both. The politicians and the general population are very happy to have scientific views to lean on, which say that the fact that this successful republic is not destroying Indians just for the love of it. They're not enslaving blacks because they're selfish. They're not overrunning Mexican lands because they're avaricious for land. That this is part of some great inevitability of science, of really the way races are constituted. That is, the Caucasian race and even certain branches within the Caucasian race are superior.
It's a way of sort of naturalizing a social structure which everyone understood and clearly saw, that the quote-unquote the Negro, or in other regions of the country, the Native American or the Chinese, were at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. And if you can say that they are fundamentally biologically different, then they should be.
In the 1857 Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court decided that people of African ancestry, enslaved or free, could never become citizens of the United States. The opinion stated that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
There's been a remarkable transformation, because if you're thinking, say, 50 or 60 years before in American history, you've got Jefferson ambiguously talking about, well, he thinks possibly blacks are not quite of the same capacity as whites, but he isn't sure. By the time you get to the 1850s, people are writing, there are deep, irrevocable gulfs between the races.
The conflict over slavery led the nation to war. After President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, his administration consulted Louis Agassiz on how to deal with the newly freed black population. Agassiz advised, "Beware of how we give to the blacks rights by virtue of which they may endanger the progress of whites. They are incapable of living on a footing of social equality."
If America had just looked the world in the eye and said, we hold these people in slavery because we need their labor and we've got the power to do it. Now that would have been much better, because then when the power was gone, when slavery is over, it's over. But what we said was, there's something about these people. By doing that, it means that when slavery is over, that rationalization for slavery remains.
In the late 19th century, as the United States expanded beyond its continental borders, ideas of racial difference would become widely accepted at home and help define a new role for America abroad.
So what the history of this notion of race teaches us is that, biologically speaking, race is an illusion. It is a social construct that serves an ideological purpose. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not real, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have real power and consequence in the lives of many people. It just means that race has more to do with ideology than it does a biological reality. Now, continuing our etymological reflection on the word racism, let's look now at that last syllable in the word, ism. Whenever we see an ISM at the end of a word, it signals something very important to us. Now, etymologically speaking, ism refers to a system of beliefs and doctrines and other kinds of systems. So it signals, when you see ism at the end of the word, it signals that we're talking about something more than just individual attitudes and behaviors. So, for instance, words like communism, capitalism, socialism, and even Catholicism cannot be fully understood solely in terms of individual attitudes and behavior. For instance, no one would claim that a complete understanding of capitalism is possible by focusing exclusively on individual attitudes and behaviors. The same is true for racism. So we need an understanding of racism that includes individual attitudes and behaviors, but also includes the way that these attitudes and behaviors get expressed and normalized within institutions and systems. Now, one of the obstacles in our conversations about race is the confusion we sometimes have in distinguishing the difference between race prejudice and racism. As we've learned from the videos, race is an arbitrary socio-biological classification that was created by Europeans to assign human worth and social status to different groups of people. Prejudice, as the word indicates, is the practice of prejudging others based on preconceived notions, beliefs, and personal experiences. Now, when it comes to race prejudice, everyone of every race has some level of race prejudice. And while it's always wrong, people of all races can be guilty of harboring racial prejudices in their hearts and in their minds. But race prejudice becomes racism when the prejudices of the dominant group become institutionalized, when their prejudices become collectively enforced in systems and in institutions for their benefit and the detriment of minority groups. So I would like to offer a definition of racism for these 4 sessions that I use when I do anti-racism training. It's a simple formulation that's easy to remember, and I think it can be helpful for us in understanding and dismantling racism. And this is it. Racism equals race prejudice plus the sanctioned misuse of institutional and systemic power. Now, of course, there are many good definitions of racism out there, and I'm not asking you to abandon or discard any definition of racism that you currently hold. But what I am asking you to do is to, try out this definition during this course and this time together. Hold it loosely in your mind. And if you feel that it's useful, then keep it. And if you don't, then at the end of the 4 sessions, cast it aside and go with whatever definition works for you. Now, next week's presentation is going to explore how race prejudice and institutional and systemic power combine to make racism such a powerful force in our lives. But for the remainder of this hour, I want to invite your questions and comments. As I mentioned before, you can ask a question or make a comment using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Only Bill is going to see that, and Bill will relay your question or comment to me for my chance to respond and try my best to answer. Okay, so I don't know, Bill, if you've got any questions on tap, but we're ready to go whenever you are.
All right, Tom, so the first question is whether the pseudoscience as it's used taking place in the other parts of the world, as well as the process that was described in the video, the so-called scientific inquiry that was underway, was that unique to the U.S., or was that being similar studies being done elsewhere in the world?
That's an excellent question. My understanding is that actually it was the first notions of race really were developed in Europe. This was during the time of the Western Enlightenment, when everything was scientific. People were really into science. And also this whole idea of categorizing everything, especially after Darwin and the origin of species in his work. Scientists went about trying to catalog and sort out and all kinds of organisms, including human beings. So I think the notion of scientific racism is a product of Europe that quickly came over here into this country.
Thank you. Tom, the next question is whether these concepts and the research and so forth, did that information get spread more widely than just academia and scientific societies? Was that widely available in the general public, and would that have gotten into, let's say, schools, grammar schools, high schools, things like that? Would that have been more widely published than beyond the scientific societies?
Oh, absolutely. They became popularized almost immediately, especially in this country. They became very much popularized in textbooks, taught to kids. Also, as you saw from the video, I mean, there were large public gatherings and speeches made. That book on that they talked about sold out in its first printing, and printed many more editions of that. So yeah, it was very, very much popularized and very much spread throughout, especially, because, remember, the people in the South had a vested interest in making this as popular and as well known as possible in order to protect the institution of slavery and the benefits it gave them.
Thank you, Tom. The next question is, how does eugenics enter into the definition you are offering?
Right. Well, eugenics comes out of the whole pseudoscientific understanding of race in that regard. So while eugenics, the ideology of eugenics can be racialized, that certain lives are worth saving and others are not, or certain lives or types of people should be prohibited from procreating and some should be allowed. The eugenics also spread into other kinds of classifications of people based on other factors. So you had people who would be mentally ill, or people who may be handicapped would fall into this eugenics. And of course, the biggie, of course, is Hitler and what the Nazis did. Their beliefs on eugenics, of course, got shattered by, the U.S. African-American athletes during the 38 Olympics in Germany, but that didn't stop them from continuing to spread the superiority of the Aryan race in that way. What a lot of people don't understand is a lot of the eugenics that informed the racial policies of Nazi Germany, they learned from the United States. Eugenics was really big in the United States for a while, even before Hitler and the Nazis, and was actively done. There were stories of women of color and others who were sterilized without their permission or without their consent. Those kinds of things happen all the time, which is, again, part of the reason why many people of color are really hesitant about taking this COVID vaccine, because they've had this long history of being abused and also discarded by the medical establishment based on old eugenics types of thinking.
Tom, you also actually answered another question in your response. There was a question about whether Hitler's philosophies and theories were sourced from United States-based activities. So you answered that question as well. The next question is, would it be useful to abandon the race questions from various forms such as the US Census or other forms that we submit to the government?
Okay. You know, at one level, it would be a good thing to not have that, have a need for that kind of data, to collect that kind of data. But where we are right now, we aren't there. We're not even close to there. So having the kind of data where we can measure how African Americans and people of color are faring economically compared to white community people is an important measure for us to be able to understand how racism is still operating in society. And again, in terms of racism, in terms of outcomes, not just the intention of people, but the outcomes of actions. So we would never know that predominantly and mostly people of color are executed in this country for capital punishment unless we kept that kind of data. So it is still useful and needed. Maybe there'll become a time when it isn't no longer needed, but where we are right now, I think that kind of data and that kind of information is vitally important.
Thank you, Tom. Tom, this may be one of your later sessions, but you mentioned early in the presentation this evening about the definition of racism in the category of sin. Can you give us a sense of when that kind of thinking within the church, was that originated relatively recently? Does that go back many centuries? Can you set us roughly in the time frame of when those kind of that kind of discussion was first initiated?
Right. It's actually pretty recent, unfortunately. Now the church, there was a time when the church sanctified slavery and the whole 9 yards in that regard. There were questions about whether or not, for instance, Native Americans had souls or not. And whether or not their lands could be taken because they really didn't have souls anyway. So there was a lot of that in church history for a long time. It really wasn't until at least until the modern civil rights era when that began to change in terms of racism. Now, in terms of slavery, the church after a few centuries, I think by about the 1700s, the Catholic Church was already speaking out against slavery, as were others as well in Europe and of course in the United States as well. But in terms of racism, I mean, the first bishop's statement really on racism didn't happen until the 1950s. And a clear declaration of racism is a sin did not happen, I don't think, until Vatican II.
Tom, at this point, we do not have any other questions in the queue.
Okay. I was thinking of we should get some of that music from the final category question and Jeopardy to play in these spots, but we didn't do that. I'm going to assume that for now people are good and they got plenty to chew on for the week. Let me just say that our next session is Thursday, March 11th at 7 o'clock. Same bat station, same bat time. On this link. You can use the same link for all 4 sessions. I hope that you found this interesting. I want to thank Bill for his help with the technology here, and I think we made it work. But otherwise, thank you very much. Take care. God bless, and we'll see you next Thursday.
Thank you, Tom.